Spotlight. We're told the film is based on actual events. It opens in Boston, Massachusetts, 1974, at a police station. An older cop tells a young one that the woman is hysterical, that she is divorced with 4 kids, and that Father Geoghegan was helping out. In an interview room, the Monsignor is talking to a distraught woman fingering rosary beads while her 3 children color with crayons. The young cop is told nobody can discuss this case with the papers and that the case isn't going to be arraigned. It's now July 2001. We're at the Boston Globe newsroom. A reporter named Stewart is retiring to be replaced by a new editor. Robbie, Michael Keaton, gives a playful speech about his departure. Another reporter, Mark Ruffalo, carries a piece of cake downstairs to the Spotlight department, a small office with only 2 others on staff, Satya Pfeiffer, Rachel McAdams, and Matt Carroll, Brian Darcy James. They are the investigative team for the Boston Globe, all working so hard on a story, they have to eat the cake for their lunch. They mention how sad it is to see Stewart go to a bigger paper and mention many others are leaving the company. The new boss, that is coming on Monday, is said to have cut a lot of people from the paper here and in Miami. They worry he's going to phase out Spotlight. Nobody has met him yet, but Robbie is going to have lunch with him. We cut to that lunch meeting. Marty Barron, Liev Schreiber, is reading The Curse of the Bambino while he waits for Robbie. When Robbie suggests Marty check out a Red Sox game, Marty explains he's actually not a baseball fan, but just trying to get a feel for his new city. He asks about Spotlight, which Robbie explains is a 4-person team that does investigative, that reports to Ben Bradley Jr. They just finished a story on a negligent construction site and are looking for a new story. Marty asks how long it takes, and Robbie says it can take weeks or up to a year because they don't like to rush things. Marty asks what they are working on now, but Robbie tells him all their investigation has been on their new editor since everyone is concerned about losing their job. Marty notes this is understandable as the internet is making classifieds obsolete and they're losing revenue. Robbie asks if this is why he asked about Spotlight, but Marty tells him he had another reason. The next day, Robbie attends a 10:30 meeting where Marty is first introduced to the staff. He asks them if they've read Eileen McNamara's column about the Geoghegan case. They're only vaguely familiar, so he tells them it's about a priest that molested kids in 6 different parishes over the last 30 years. The lawyer for the victims, Mr. Garabedian, said that Cardinal Law found out about it 15 years earlier and did nothing. The cardinal denies this, but the lawyer claims he has documents to prove it. He says they should write a story on this since it's only been in their paper twice in the last 6 months. Robbie points out the documents are sealed, but Marty tells him they can take the church to court for access. Ben confirms that he is suggesting they sue the Catholic Church. Marty says technically all they're doing is filing a motion to lift the seals on these documents. Ben points out everyone will still consider the suing the church. Marty isn't worried. In Ben's office, Ben and Robbie update Mike on Marty's suggestion to sue for the sealed documents in the Geoghegan case. Eileen, who has written the article, gives them the lowdown on the people involved. The judge on the case is Catholic, so they aren't hopeful she will rule in their favor. Marty suggests Spotlight take the story since it's now an investigative report. Robbie tells the Spotlight group about their new story, not just the Geoghegan case, but that Cardinal Law knew about the allegations and covered it up. They decide to investigate Geoghegan, as well as Eric McLeish, the lawyer for the victims of molestation by another priest a decade earlier. Mike decides to meet with Mr. Garabedian, who's reaping the current victims. He's told he is a personality which doesn't faze Mike, he likes personalities. The next day, Mike is kept waiting when he goes to Mr. Garabedian's office. He is ignored. Satya and Robbie visit Eric McLeish, Billy Crudup, a handsome lawyer. They ask if Eric's been following the Geoghegan case, and he mentions the 80 plaintiffs with all individual cases, not a class action suit. Eric points out the molestation cases are all shitty because the statute of limitation is only 3 years and most victims don't come forward until they're adults because of shame and guilt, and they come from tough neighborhoods where they don't want other kids to know they were molested. And the charitable immunity statute caps damages at $20,000, which astonishes Robbie. Eric says they should try the cases through the press, like he did years earlier. But he adds that most of the victims are afraid to be publicly interviewed. He knows because he represented some of the victims. Eric tells them that his settling of the cases resulted in nothing more than acknowledgement of their victimhood by the bishop and a few $1,000s. He suggests Mr. Garabedian doesn't really have sealed documents, he's just bluffing to get a better deal. They think that would be risky, but he believes Mitch Garabedian would do that and asks if they've met him. We now meet Mr. Garabedian, Stanley Tucci, when Mike sneaks into his office as a client leaves. Mike reminds him of their appointment, but Mr. Garabedian tries to blow him off, telling him the Phoenix is writing an article on him. Mike tells him he's following up on the article Eileen McNamara wrote about his suit. He is told there are 86 individual suits, it's not one large one. Mr. Garabedian tells him he can't show him the documents because they're under seal. The church is trying to get him disbarred, and he doesn't want to be speaking to Mike or to be on the record in any shape, even handwritten notes. Garabedian tells him he's already talked to the Phoenix, but Mike tells him nobody reads the Phoenix, but the Globe still has power. If they cover the story, it will be read by everyone. They're just as powerful as the Catholic Church. Mike asks if he can interview some of the victims. Garabedian tells him he needs to think about it and to call him tomorrow. At the Globe, Marty meets with Richard Gilman and tells him about challenging the protective order in the Jorgen case. Gilman points out that their subscriber base is a majority Catholic but okays the lawsuit. Down in the Spotlight's office, a woman brings clippings on past reports regarding the case. Satya mentions an organization for survivors of priest molestation called SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. It's run by a man named Phil Saviano. Matt finds a clip from their religion column that mentions another priest molesting kids in Ohio and then being moved to Boston, where he did the same thing. It wasn't Cardinal Law who swept it under the rug, it was another cardinal. They now see a pattern that when these men are found molesting kids, they are quickly moved to another parish. The article mentions Tim O'Neill, a friend of Robbie's, defended the priest. Robbie meets with Tim and his wife for dinner. He asks about the priest that Tim represented and whether the cardinals covered it up. Tim says he can't talk about the case, even off the record. Satya attends church with her very Catholic grandmother, a bit torn now that she's learning more about the cardinal covering up the molestations. She looks at all the young children singing in the choir and is unnerved. At the Globe, Mike continues trying to reach out to Garabedian. Marty meets with Cardinal Law, who says he looks forward to working with the Globe. When Marty tells him they are best to perform without the church's influence, the cardinal mentions how another paper lost a lot of subscribers when the church disagreed with their stance on a topic. A secretary comes in and gives Marty a gift, a book called The Catechism of the Catholic Church. The Spotlight team meets with Phil Saviano, who runs SNAP. He tells them when he was 11, he was preyed upon by a reverend. He asks if any of them are Catholic. They all were raised Catholic, but none of them are very religious now. Saviano tells them when a parish priest pays attention to you, it's a big deal. It's like God asking you for help. So one day, when he asks for a handjob, you give it to him. This is not just physical abuse, but spiritual abuse, because it robs you of your faith. You're ashamed and many end up becoming alcoholics or drug addicts or killing themselves, hence why the organization is for survivors. He tells them about a book written on a case in Louisiana and suggests talking to Richard Sipe, a former priest who worked at a treatment center where priests are sent when they get caught. He tells them he sent all this information to the Globe about 5 years ago and they never ran the story. He was shocked because the story was big, not just Boston, but the whole country, even up to the Vatican. He knows of at least 8 priests in Boston alone who have molested children. Robbie and Mike join Ben at a baseball game with Ben Bradley and a reporter. They mention meeting with Saviano. Ben and the reporter know him because he sent hundreds of letters to their staff and they consider him not a reliable source. The next day, Mike returns to meet with Garabedian, who tells Mike that he spoke with his clients and they don't want to be in the press. Mike explains this isn't for a profile piece, but for a spotlight story much bigger that will be on the front page. This catches Garabedian's attention, who tells him to come back later that week. Robbie and Satya meet with Saviano and wonder about his credibility. He points out that he's being smeared for speaking out against the Catholic Church and complains that they never took him seriously before. They mention they have a new editor taking the story seriously and that Robbie himself is now involved and he wasn't before. Saviano is convinced and decides to connect them with some of the survivors. Satya meets with a heavy, effeminate man named Joe at a cafe. He is very sweet but nervous. Meanwhile, Mike meets with one of Garabedian's clients at his office, Patrick. He is a handsome, masculine father who explains that his dad killed himself and his mom was schizophrenic. He tells them he doesn't want his name published. The 2 interviews are intercut simultaneously. Joe was sent to a group for kids from troubled families by a nun led by the priest who raped him. Patrick was taken in by the priest after he lost his father. The priest took him to go get ice cream, which excited him. But on the drive home, he started touching Patrick through his pants, which scared him, but he couldn't do anything because it was a priest. He mentions that he never even touched his ice cream, it just melted down his arm. Joe told him his priest knew he was gay and showed him a mobile over a baby's crib with different words like homosexual, transsexual, and bisexual on it. Being attracted to men and being forced into sex at an early age really affected him. His mother found out about it years later and called the cardinal, who moved the priest to another parish years later. Satya asks if his mother ever hired a lawyer, but he said he only went to a lawyer for the first time a few years ago and was told he could only get a small settlement. Satya asks who the lawyer was, but he can't remember the name, only that he was handsome. Satya then realizes the lawyer was Eric McLeish, whom they met with earlier. Finishing his interview, Patrick is now determined to expose priests who molest kids and says they can use his name if they want. Back at the spotlight, everybody compares notes. Satya realizes McLeish has settled cases with a bunch of priests. They now have a list of 4 priests in the city who have molested kids. Mike gets in contact with Sipe, the former priest, on the phone. He is told it's not just a few bad apples molesting kids, but that it is a psychiatric phenomenon. Mike explains to Robbie later what he was told: they all target kids from low-income families with absentee fathers in need of attention. They don't target boys because they're gay, but because their actual sexuality has no basis on molesting kids. It's a form of power control. Sipe has learned of dozens of molesting priests over the years, but when he went public, the church smeared him. Mike and Robbie make their way to the basement, where Matt has pulled the annual directories listing all the priests in Boston. The directories show where every priest is in a given year. In one directory, Geoghan is listed as being on sick leave. They check the 91 directory for the year another priest was accused of molestation. He is also listed as being on sick leave. They realize it's an official designation by the church when someone is being moved after being caught molesting kids. Upstairs, they look through the directories and see emergency response and sick leave listed for all the molesting priests they know about. Marty is visited in his office by a critic who tells him that reporting on the church story could lose them a lot of subscribers. Marty realizes this is why he was invited to a Catholic Charities gala. Satya and Robbie meet with Eric McLeish again, who won't talk about the cases he settled against a priest that molested Joe, the effeminate victim Satya met with. They mention other cases and Satya asks why there aren't any records. Eric tells them he dealt directly with the church, that it was a private mediation. Back in the office, Satya realizes there's no paper trail because the victim had to sign a confidentiality agreement to get the settlement. Everything was done under the table, and the lawyer gets his fee from the church, who then maintains their clean image by washing the crime clean. Because Eric was confirmed to have defended the priests that molested the victims they were connected to through Saviano, it gives him credibility. They are now looking at 7 or 8 priests they can discuss in their story. Marty and Robbie attend a gala run by the Catholic Church. Robbie was invited by a friend from the high school he went to, which is across the street from the Globe. They are surrounded by powerful people in the Catholic Church and meet 2 of them, Jack Dunn and Peter Conley. Robbie tells Marty that when they were investigating one of the priests a decade earlier, Cardinal Law called down the wrath of God on them, and one of their editors broke his leg skiing days later. Tim O'Neill, the lawyer who defended priests in the past, greets Robbie at the bar. Robbie mentions how Eric McLeish admitted to settling cases with the archdiocese out of court, quietly, with cash and a handshake. Robbie asks how many priests Tim has represented, but Tim says he can't answer that because it's unethical. Robbie tells Tim that he should want to be on the right side of this. On the same night, Mike meets with Garabedian for dinner and is told that one of his clients filed a criminal complaint, but the church stepped in to protect Geoghan, using their friends like Eric McLeish. Garabedian mentions it took an outsider at the Globe, a new Jewish editor, to break a story. He tells Mike that it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a village to abuse one. At the Globe the next day, Satya realizes there are several of the same terms that the directories uses when a priest is unexplainably removed from his parish. Richard Sipe, the former priest, calls in and Mike puts him on speakerphone. Sipe tells them that only 50% of the clergy practice celibacy, which creates a culture of secrecy, covering up sex between consensual adults, which extends over to covering up pedophiles. He continues, telling them that in 1985, a secretary canonist warned that pedophile priests would be $1 billion liability. Sipe estimates that 6% of all priests molest minors. Out of the 1,500 priests in Boston, that means 90 priests would be molesting kids. Robbie suggests they use the directories to look up any priests listed as being on sick leave or absent on leave or unassigned who are moved from parish to parish every few years. They all begin working on compiling a list of names with these designations. The entire team works tirelessly on scanning the directories. At home, Matt realizes one of the priests he's found lives on his block. He goes outside and stares at the house, flabbergasted. He puts a sign on his refrigerator telling his kids to stay away from the house. At the office, they've finally compiled all their data into a spreadsheet. They have a list of 87 priests that the directory seems to suggest are molesting kids, right in line with the 6% of priests that SIPE suggested. Robbie calls Tim O'Neill and asks him if there are as many as 90 priests that have been caught molesting kids in Boston. Tim tells him he has to stop this. Matt enters Robbie's office and tells him that he discovered one of the molesters lived on his block and asks him whether he can tell the neighbors about their findings. Robbie tells him they'll tell them soon. Robbie meets with Eric McLeish, telling him he has a list of 87 priests that are potential molesters. He needs to know which ones Eric has settled cases for to verify their crimes since the directories are circumstantial. Robbie threatens Eric that there are two stories, one about the clergy covering for priests and the other about lawyers who spent 10 years profiting off of sex scandals, never going public with the dozens of priests that were molesting boys. Eric agrees to help, but says that he actually told the Globe about it years earlier, and they buried the story. At the Globe, Satcha gets new clips and finds something very interesting, a clip that confirms that McLeish did give them a heads up years earlier. At the Globe, Robbie reveals that McLeish has shared a list of 46 priests he represented, along with some victims' names. Some of the victims of the 8 they were told about by Saviano have agreed to go on record. Marty is concerned about law, referencing Robbie's story about how he called down the wrath of God after their past report. He wonders why he had such an extreme reaction when they reported on a single priest in the 90s, given that the priest was elsewhere in Massachusetts. Robbie suggests law had to know there were others, and it was a bigger story, even bigger than 50 priests. They suspect that the church manipulated the system so the priests wouldn't face charges, that reporting on the molestations won't get a public reaction. They seem like isolated incidents, but showing that the cover-ups came from the top will. Ben pulls Mike and Robbie in his office. He is worried that Cardinal Law is going to bully them if they run a story, which could tank their paper. They have to take Law down in a way that he won't be able to recover from, and he won't be able to smear them. That night, Satcha is leaving and shares with Robbie the clip that she found, confirming McLeish's story. Robbie looks it over, but has no response. The entire group begins to investigate cops who were involved in the arresting of the priests and how the church covered it up, including the cop on duty in the film's opener. Back at the office, Matt asks Robbie if he knows of a Father Talbot at BC High. He remembers him from when he went there. He is given a printout about him. Mike is in court watching the case the Globe is filing against a church to unseal documents. The Catholic judge seems antagonistic to the Globe. The church's lawyer accuses them of just wanting to sell papers and Mr. Garabedian just wants to help his cases. Outside, Garabedian tells Mike that a priest discovered Geoghan was molesting boys in 1962, but when he told the bishop, he was threatened into silence. Then, 30 years later, when he read about Geoghan molesting hundreds of boys, he felt guilty and called Garabedian, who asked the priest to come in and sit for a deposition on having given the church a heads up. But when he showed up, he was with the same lawyer attacking the Globe in court that day. Now the priest states he has a foggy memory and negates his claim that he told his superiors. A year earlier, Garabedian found an article from a local paper revealing the priest finally went to the press to tell them about being silenced by officials in the 60s. Now that he had him on record, he has a good reason to talk to him again. But when he filed a motion to depose him, the church's lawyer filed a motion opposing his motion. However, this allowed Garabedian to make an argument why he should be allowed to depose the priest, and he's able to present the documents that have been sealed earlier. These 14 documents prove everything about the church, the bishops, Cardinal Law, and now it's all public in his case. But if Mike goes into a courtroom and tries to retrieve them, he'll find they are missing because the church had them removed. Garabedian tells Mike to check the docket. Mike does, and sure enough, the exhibits folder is empty. Mike calls Robbie and tells him about the documents. He says that if the Globe's lawyer files a motion for the lawsuit against the church, the judge will order Garabedian to refile the documents. The next morning, Everyone is gathered around a TV. It is September 11th, and they are watching the terrorist attack unfold on the news. Later, Cardinal Law is on TV, giving a speech about praying for the nation. Ben orders the Spotlight team to stop their story so they can focus on 9/11's, the only story that could derail them from their larger investigation. Mike is sent away to Florida to investigate the flight school that trained the pilot of the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. He calls Garabedian and begs him not to refile the documents until he returns. Once he does, they'll be public record and another newspaper can break the story without all of the information they've uncovered. Garabedian says he can't make any promises. Robbie meets with Saviano to tell him they've been taken off the story because the country needs the church at this time. Saviano points out he needed the church at one point and that a lot of people relived painful experiences in an effort to expose the crimes. He threatens to take the story to the Herald. Satya calms him down by telling him they're not abandoning the story. She's met with too many survivors and their families to not tell the story, but they need to tell it right and need a few more weeks. This calms Saviano down. In Florida, Mike gets a call from Robbie who tells him that Garabedian refiled the docs. He is then told Marty has been put back on the story because of this. Mike flies back to Boston that afternoon. Robbie visits the high school he went to and talks to the principal about the 7 victims that have come forth about being molested by Father Talbot there. It is clear to Robbie that the brothers in charge must have known about the crimes because of how tightly run everything was. Jack Dunn and Peter Conley, who Robbie met at the Catholic Gala, are there, defending the school. But the school's president says that, if he was on board at the time, he would have done something. He admits that they must have known, since they sent Father Talbot out of town after he was caught. Robbie is told by Jack that the president's statement is off the record. Outside, Robbie points out to Jack that both of them were athletes, while Father Talbot was a coach at the school. They escaped molestation by pure luck. Robbie notes that the Boston Globe is directly across the street from where these crimes took place. Mike gets to the courthouse and tries to get the documents. The clerk is standoffish and asks him if he knows what he's retrieving. He is then told, because of their sensitive nature, he must meet with a judge upstairs. He rushes up there and is given permission. When he gets back down and finally gets the documents, he's told he can't take them out of the building. He says he's going to make copies, but is told the copy room closed at 4 p.m. He then gives the clerk $83 in his pocket in exchange for using their personal copier. The documents reveal the church knew about the molestations based on letters written to Cardinal Law and how he demanded the victims' families keep silent. Another letter is from an auxiliary bishop who broke ranks, acknowledging Geoghegan has a history of homosexual involvement with young boys in an attempt to find some solution beyond a mild punishment of weekend work. Mike wants to write up the story, but Robbie tells him to hold off, that there are 90 other cases out there and they need to get more evidence corroborating them to tell the bigger story. Mike is furious, worried that the Herald is going to steal the story before them and butcher it. He is adamant that they nailed the scumbags and they need to print the story to show the church that they can't get away with what they've done. Mike finds Satchev at home. He asks her if she's ever thought of going back to church. She says she has attended with her grandmother, but it's hard with all the things they now know. Mike mentions, growing up Catholic, it's hard to abandon it completely, but after reading those letters, his faith collapsed. Robbie meets up with Peter Conley in a hotel bar. Peter complains about Marty and says running the story will lose them subscribers. He tells Robbie he doesn't want his career to be ended and him forever to be known as the guy who brought down the Globe. He writes the entire story off as being just a few bad apples. Robbie realizes this is how the church operates. They have one guy lean on someone and the entire town looks the other way. At the Spotlight office the next day, Robbie is told that Sweeney ruled in favor of the Globe to unseal the documents. The church has filed an appeal, but the trial court is almost always upheld in manners like this. The documents will probably be released in mid-January, around the time Geoghegan's trial begins. Ben and the Globe's editor want to make their success against the Catholic Church a big story, focusing on a First Amendment victory, but Robbie doesn't want to alert the Herald of the story. Mike and Robbie now tell Marty and Ben how some of the documents have already become public due to Garabedian slipping them into a public motion. These documents prove Law knew about the molestations in the 80s. Ben is upset that they didn't release the story, but Robbie tells him that the church covering up molestation has been going on for decades, even before Law, and the court covered it up. They think they can write everything up in 2 weeks, but suspect it will be a poor move to publish the story during the first Christmas season after September 11th. They decide to run it right after New Year's, shortly before the Geoghan trial begins. Marty now tells the editor to bury the Globe's victory over the church in the Metro section. The Spotlight team steps up their story. Mike begins writing. The team continues meeting with victims, priests, judges. The wife of a priest yells at Satcha when she asks to speak with him. The sister of a victim is also hostile. But Satcha also gets to speak to someone who is happy to talk. The team is getting quotes from various sources. Robbie visits Tim O'Neill at his house, led in by Tim's wife. Robbie tells Tim they're running out of time. He tells him they've got the cover-up stories of 75 priests, but they need a solid confirmation from him because he represented them. He tells Tim he has to choose what side he's on. Tim tells Robbie he's out of line, but Robbie responds that the entire city is out of line: lawyers, politicians, cops. Everybody is looking the other way, but Tim can put an end to it. Tim gets riled up, says that he defended the scumbags, but it was his job to. He points out the Globe had a lot of information that could have alerted them to the story, but they never did any investigating, so they're just as guilty as everyone else. Robbie is kicked out of Tim's home. But as he walks to his car, Tim runs to him and asks for the list. Tim reads it over and then circles every single name, verifying them as clients he once represented. Through Jack Dunn, Mike is able to make an offer to law to defend himself and the Globe in a full-page, unedited response. But later, he visits Marty and Ben to tell them that law turned the offer down, and the archdiocese spokeswoman says they don't even want to know what the questions are. This gives them enough of a quote for their story. The church had no interest in knowing what the Globe's questions would be. Ben wonders about manning the phones come Sunday morning given all the attention the story will get. Robbie tells him Matt and Satcha will be there working on a piece and they'll have a tip line listed where people can call with more information. Ben wants to hire extra staff to man the phones at reception, remembering the protests from the last story about a molesting priest. He's also concerned about picketers and angry letters. Robbie mentions Tim confirming all the priests they suspected as being involved. He has been rattled by Tim's comment that the Globe should have caught it sooner. Ben tells him the story needed spotlight since no singular reporter could have broken it. But Robbie is still upset he was one of the reporters in the department that ran the story years earlier, the clip that Satcha gave to him, and he never thought to investigate it further. Marty tells them all to forgive their past sins because they need to prepare for law's backlash after the story is published. As hard as they've worked over the last 6 months, they're going to have to work even harder from this point on. The team leaves for the night, content with all of their work. Mike stops by Garabedian's office and gives him an early look at the paper. When he leaves, he sees a mother and 2 children in a waiting room. The mother is fingering rosary beads. It's a callback to the opening scene at the police station with a mother in a waiting room with her kids. Garabedian tells Mike that both boys were abused weeks earlier and encourages Mike to keep doing his work. Sipe calls Mike about the story. Mike asks him how he's able to continue to believe in something after all he knows. Sipe says he still needs his faith. The church is an institution of men, and even well-meaning men fail. The papers are printed, come off the presses, are transported around the city by trucks. They end up on doorsteps, in living rooms. The headline on the front page: Church allowed abuse by priest for years. Matt takes a copy of the paper and drops it on the doorstep of the house where the molesting priest lives. Sunday morning, Matty is looking out his window. He notes that there aren't any protesters. His colleague suggests they're still at church. Robbie finds Mike in the parking lot, even though it's their day off. They want to go inside and get a sense of the response they're getting. Inside, the main receptionist is bored, saying it's the easiest overtime she's made because nobody is calling their phone lines. She mentions that she had to send people down in the Spotlight office to help out Matt and Satcha. Mike and Robbie rush down to the office. Phones are ringing off the hook. After getting off a call, Matt tells them they're getting tons of response, almost all positive, and many from victims who have more tips. Matt suggests Robbie and Mike help out. Mike answers a phone. Ending titles indicate that the cover-ups were revealed to have extended far beyond Massachusetts. Hundreds of U.S. cities is listed as having similar scandals. Then dozens of countries are listed, as well, where the abuse also extended to.